Hi, I'm David,
And I'm Brienne.
and we are back for another video in our series going through the Song of Solomon. Today we're going to be talking about courtship. And whenever I say courtship, I just need you to realize right off the bat, and this is something we've talked about in previous videos, that the way that I'm sectioning off these various different segments and the elements of this relationship and the progressive stages of this relationship in this book are really based off of our modern approach to romance and dating in our current culture, specifically in Western culture. And I don't want to suggest that this is how they did this back in the 10th century BC, right? Marriage and all that stuff was approached in a very different way back then, but we do see a lot of parallels between the couple in the Song of Songs and modern day approaches to romance. And so I sectioned it off kind of how we approach it nowadays, right? So we had principles of attraction. And then as the couple grew closer together, we saw principles of dating as they started spending more time together and started considering the possibility of pursuing one another. And then now, as we go into this section, the back half of chapter 2, we're going to talk about principles of courtship. And when I say courtship, I'm specifically talking about intentional pursuit of one another with an intentional desire to take steps towards marriage, right? And that is what we're talking about whenever it comes to courtship, because that's where it seems that we find this couple at this section of the book. In the back half of chapter 2, they have already looked at one another, they have examined one another, they have come to the conclusion that this is somebody worth pursuing, and now in this section, they are intentionally pursuing marriage, and we're going to see elements of that. Really, it seems like this entire section that we're talking about here is just one big proposal. And the aftermath of that. And so it's not going to be a perfect parallel to what we mean whenever we say courtship, both traditionally and even nowadays. But I just wanted to clarify that so that we knew right off the bat what we were talking about when we're talking about principles of courtship.
Yep.
But that being said, we don't want this video to be too long, so I'm just going to hand this over to Brienne. And Brienne, could you just read these first two verses for us?
It says, "The voice of my beloved, behold, he is coming, leaping on the mountains, jumping on the hills. My beloved is like a gazelle or a young stag. Behold, he is standing behind our wall. He gazes through the windows. He is peering through the lattice."
Perfect. Thank you. So right off the bat, we see that this girl hears something. And it seems like there's a break between chapter 2, verse 7 and chapter 2, verse 8. Because if you remember, in the last video, what we saw is that this girl has been so captivated by this guy that she just feels peace and security spending time with him. And her desires were just really just building up for her, like building up for him, to where it got to the point where she was so overwhelmed by her desires for him that she just had to turn to her friends and say, "Hey, I charge you, don't awaken love before it pleases," right? So she's saying, let's reel it in and save it for marriage. And it seems like those growing desires are the things that are ultimately catapulting them towards marriage, right? Which is kind of how God designed it, right? You have these desires and these sexual desires, and ultimately that's supposed to help motivate you to take steps towards marriage. And that's where we find this couple right here. And we see that this girl hears the voice of her beloved. But we're not going to actually see what he says until we get to verse 10, right? And we're going to actually see what he says there, but she's going to describe the content of what he's saying with these descriptive words, and it's going to be the imagery of this guy showing up at her house, right? And whether or not he's actually showing up at her house, I don't know. Right? We have to realize that this is poetry. It is love poetry. And so there's a lot of, it's emotion, right? So there's a lot of imagery here, and whether or not this guy is literally doing this thing, I don't know. It's not narrative. But this is the imagery that you're supposed to imagine as he is doing these things, right? So she hears his voice, and as a result of what he's saying, this is how she describes him. He is coming. He is leaping on the mountains, jumping on the hills. My beloved is like a gazelle or a young stag. Behold, he is standing behind our wall. He gazes through the windows. He's peering through the lattice. She imagines him as a young, like a goat or a stag or a gazelle, bounding over the hills. The idea is that he has all this energy. And he's coming closer to her, right? He is going over the hills to come see her. And then whenever he gets closer, it's like he's standing behind the wall. He's looking through the windows. He really just wants to gain a glimpse of her, right? And the imagery is that this guy just really wants to spend time with this girl. And given the way that she describes him, you get to see that he is much more energetic than we've seen him before. And we've already seen that there is this mutual desire between the couple to spend time with one another. But this guy seems like he is on a mission. Right? It seems like
something in mind.
Yes. It seems like he has something in mind and he wants to accomplish something with this, and she seems to pick up on that too. Right? There's something about what's in his voice that she's like, man, this guy is eager.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing I highlighted, and don't worry, I'm going to let Brienne talk in a second. But one thing that I highlighted to our students, because we're going, the whole reason we're doing this series is because I'm also going through this with my high school students over the course of the summer. One thing I highlighted here, and I don't know if you would immediately pick up on it from just reading these 2 verses, but whenever you look at the song as a whole and you compare what happens here to something that happens a little bit later on, once you get to like chapter 5 of the book, one thing I want you to notice is that the imagery is of him coming over the hills and approaching her house and looking through the windows and looking through the lattice. And he obviously wants to get into her, but she doesn't necessarily open the door.
Yeah.
Right? And it's something very understated to where there's nothing in these verses that would indicate to you that she is hesitant to receive him. But the verses that follow will demonstrate that she actually is hesitant for some reason. And whenever you go later on and you get to chapter 5, you're going to see a very similar scenario where he comes and he's knocking at the door and she doesn't want to open up. And so it seems like there's this parallel where you have to know the whole song in and of itself to recognize what's going on here. But she sees that this guy is super excited. And normally she would be like, oh, my beloved, yes. Like, let me open the door.
Yeah.
But that's not what's happening. Instead, she hears his voice. And in that voice is this deep and profound energy, like a gazelle bounding over the hills. And he evidently wants to be close to her, but there's still this layer of separation, and she's not doing anything. She's not being proactive and breaking apart that separation. And so that's something I just wanted to highlight right off the bat there. Is there anything that we talked about with the group or anything that I maybe haven't addressed so far right there, or anything that just sticks out to you about what she's saying about this guy?
I would say the one thing whenever I read this section, I immediately think of like go back to the beginning of the book, and I think it's chapter 1, whenever, you know, she's inquiring of him and she's like, hey, where can I find you like out in the fields? I want to know exactly where you are so I can, you know, just pursue you. I'm not going around talking to all these guys. Like and he kind of flirts back with her. And so that's something that I think you can easily compare to this. There's like that mutual kind of like flirtation and excitement to like be around one another and be really excited. But here you see that it is kind of just one side. So whenever I read this, I immediately kind of think about that previous kind of scene in their relationship. So
Well, and it's also interesting because, like you mentioned, there is that reciprocity earlier on where it's like she wants to spend time with him, he wants to spend time with her. And the way that she talks about his arrival isn't in a negative sense, right? It's not like she doesn't want him around. It's nothing like that. It's just simply that we don't see the returned activity, right? That's the main thing that should give us pause, because really throughout the whole song, this girl has been taking the initiative a lot, which is really surprising in that culture, right? I mean, the whole song starts with her saying, kiss me with the kiss of your mouth. And she's saying, draw me after you. Let us run. Where do I find you at noon? Like, that is, like, she's been taking the initiative. And now we see him doing what he's always been doing. She just isn't doing anything in response, right? And that in and of itself should kind of speak volumes, because it's not that she doesn't like that he's doing this. You just see that she seems more guarded, right? And it's possible because this directly flows from verse 7, right? Where she is guarding her heart and does not want to awaken love before it pleases. And maybe she's overwhelmed by this whole thing. But we're going to explore that over the course of this video and over the course of these verses, because we're going to see that there is something that is holding this girl back. And we'll address that more fully later on when we talk about the actual principles to draw from this. But let's move on, and I'm going to read through this, and I'm going to talk about what this guy says, and then I'm going to let Brienne explain it. So she had said that she heard the voice of her beloved, and this is what he was saying. My beloved answered and said to me, arise, my darling, my beautiful one, and come along. For behold, the winter is past, the rain is over, it is gone. The flowers have appeared in the land, the time for pruning has arrived. And the voice of the turtle dove has been heard in our land. The fig tree has ripened its figs, and the vines in blossom have given forth their fragrance. Arise, my darling, my beautiful one, and come along. All right, so what is this guy communicating?
So essentially, without going in like really deep detail, it's kind of a proposal. He's kind of saying like, hey, we have this really awesome relationship that's going on that, you know, we are able to pursue God together, and the people around us, our community, also agree that our relationship is really good. Let's get married. And so he's essentially kind of proposing to her here, which is it's really sweet. I think the way that he kind of introduces that, and we see kind of this, like, we called it like a something sandwich is what we
I
called
just
it. I
called it a
forget.
sandwich, yeah.
Yeah. And so it says, "Arise, my darling, my beautiful one, and come along." And so he starts with that and he ends with that. And kind of sandwiched in between that, he gives this description of seasons passing. And so it starts from winter and goes into spring, and so kind of showing like the progression of the relationship, and is like, hey, we have this like really amazing thing that's going, and we're not even married yet. Like, imagine what can happen if if we get married. My life before you was just winter, but now that I have you, like, my life is blossoming. I'm like pruning fruit from trees. Like, he sees that his life is so much greater whenever she's around. He's like, we need to pursue this. We should get married.
Yeah. And if you're wondering why we come to the conclusion that this seems like a proposal, it's kind of just taking verses 8 and 9 and then this, and then taking what follows afterwards and all combining it together. Really, the context is what kind of gets you there. Because in the previous verses, it seemed like she was aware that he's on a mission, right? He's not just arriving to say hi.
Right.
He's bounding over the hills. He is looking. He is eager to communicate something. And then you look at this whole sandwich structure, like she pointed out here. It begins and ends with him making a request to her. He says, get up and come along, right? And in between, my darling, my beautiful one, right? Arise and come with me. Well, where's he wanting to go, right? Where does he want to possibly go with her? And you have to look at the meat of the sandwich to look at that, like to get the answer to that, right? Because the bread is him saying, arise and come along, arise and come along. That's the bread of the sandwich. And then the meat in the middle, that is the essence of the proposal, right? Because that is why he wants her to arise and come along. He says, hey, winter has passed, spring has arrived. Before I met you, everything was dead and cold and gray. But now that we're together, life is blossoming. And all of a sudden, there's new life all around. And it's like love itself has been resurrected with us, right? All of a sudden, the winter is past. The rain is over. It is gone. The flowers have appeared in the land. He's seeing beauty arising from this relationship that they have with one another. And as they've been pursuing one another, they've both felt more secure in that love and in that relationship. And like Brianne pointed out, they've had the support of their community, and they have handled things in such a mature and godly manner that he's like, hey, like, let's go and let's do this, right? Arise and come with me, because what we have is something beautiful. Let's not let it go to waste. While spring has arrived, let's do something about this, right? And so that's ultimately what he's communicating with this. And if you're still not on page with it being a proposal, we have to see what follows afterwards to see how she responds. And just to summarize it so that you're on the same track with us, we're going to see that there is something that's holding her back from fully committing. And we're not going to fully know what that thing is. We're just going to see how he describes it and how he handles it. And by the end of this section, she's going to say, turn, my beloved, and go. And basically, she's accepting the proposal and saying, hey, go and get a house ready for us so that we can get married. And then whenever we get to next week's stuff, we're going to see them in the engagement or betrothal time period where they're in this time of waiting as they anticipate their coming marriage. And so it seems like that's kind of fitting for what we would view as a modern proposal. And this guy is just excited, right? He sees this girl, he knows the relationship they share, and he just eagerly wants to take the next step. Arise, my darling, my beautiful one, and come along. Is there anything else that you think we need to address about these verses in particular?
I think we talked about a little bit really throughout the entire course of this book. If you just kind of see it as kind of a central theme, there's a lot of comparing their love to like seasons, and winter and spring being like their relationship growing and blossoming. And so you see that kind of sprinkled throughout the entire book, which I think is just something good to point out. But yeah,
cool.
That's about it.
Also just looking down at my notes, there is this one commentary that I read where he just gave a good description of what is being described in these verses. And the way that he said it is this: verses 11 through 13 list a number of phenomena associated with spring. Poetically, it thus evokes a scene of newness, vigor, freshness, joy, and expectation, a context for joyous lovemaking. Right? I just like that because it was just a nice, concise way of putting it. That is what this guy's communicating. And the girl, when she hears his voice, she perceives that that's what he's suggesting, right? He's got something in mind. He's like, this is something new and beautiful. Let's do something about it, right? And he wants to take that next step. Because their desires are growing, he wants to make that commitment. And so let's move on to these final verses, because really this is the main meat of what we want to focus on, because this stuff is just laying the groundwork for the principles to learn during this crucial time period of a couple's relationship. I'm going to read this so that Brienne can begin to kind of explain it. "O my dove, in the clefts of the rock, in the secret place of the steep pathway, let me see your appearance. Let me hear your voice. For your voice is sweet and your appearance is lovely." Let's just talk about that verse first. And really, let's just talk about maybe the first 2 lines of that verse. How does this guy view this girl? What exactly is going on here? Because you kind of have to understand those 2 lines to understand everything in this video.
Yeah.
So what's happening?
Yeah. So he's equating her to a dove. And so whenever he says, "Oh, my dove," he's talking about her. And we see from these 2 lines that it seems like she's kind of retreating away. So he comes bounding over the hills, really excited. He wants to see her. And we see that she's kind of like unsure about something. We don't necessarily know yet what it is. But she seems to be kind of retreating. So she's going in the clefts of the rock, in a secret place, a steep pathway. So he's talking about how she's really far away. He can't really see her. He can't really get to her. And she's retreating away from him to where they can't really communicate with one another about what's going on, what she's thinking, stuff like that.
Yeah. And once again, the imagery is imagery, right? Yes. I heavily doubt that she has turned into a literal dove hiding in the cliffs.
Yeah.
Instead, this guy perceives that something is wrong. Once again, to go back to the part where she was excited about his arrival, yet for some reason, she wasn't immediately opening the door. And he perceives that, right? And he can tell, probably just because they've gotten to know one another, he can tell something's up. And he senses this distance, and that's why he very gently calls her a dove, but it's like she's a dove that's flitted away and hid itself in the cliffs. He can tell that in this great moment of deeper intimacy, something's pulling her back, and something's keeping her from taking that next step. And we kind of just talked about this with our group, how it's kind of beautiful that we don't know what it was that made her back away, because it makes the application for this and the principle that we learn from it even better. Because rather than just confining it to one specific issue, it can be very broad, right? This is just a couple who has grown closer together, and then somewhere along the road, as they grow closer, something happened that has caused her to withdraw. Maybe it's his fault. Maybe it's her fault. That doesn't really matter either, right? The question is that, or the main issue is that he senses some sort of conflict, and he's going to set in motion the steps to resolve that conflict, which is really important, especially as you step into courtship, right? Because whenever you get to courtship, you have these 2 people who have spent time with one another. They have come to the idea that they want to pursue one another in marriage. But naturally, as you grow closer to another individual, you start learning more about them. And through that, as you love them more, you make yourself more vulnerable to them. And that's a scary place to be in. And so we don't know why this girl has withdrawn from him, but maybe it has to do with those insecurities we've already read about, right? Maybe those insecurities are cropping back up, and for some reason she's withdrawing away. Maybe she's overwhelmed by how amazing this guy is, because we've seen that he has done almost everything perfectly. And maybe she thinks that she's undeserving of this guy. Maybe he did something wrong and he just doesn't know about it, right? We don't know what it is that's caused her to withdraw. The context would seem to suggest that it's not his fault, that it seems more it's just like her own issue, but we don't know, right? We don't know what it is, but he knows her well enough to know that she has withdrawn for some reason. And so he comes to her and he says, "My dove in the clefts of the rock." He doesn't just call her out, and he's not mean about it. And he doesn't say, "Hey, what the heck's up?" Instead he says, "Hey, honey, talk to me," right? "Oh, my dove in the clefts of the rock, in the secret place, the steep pathway. Oh, my love, who you feel distant." And he says, "Let me see your appearance. Let me hear your voice." You can almost imagine it like he's holding her close, and she won't look him in the eyes, and she won't talk. And he says, "Look at me. Speak to me," right? And then he goes on, and before he even gives her a chance to speak, he says this, and this is probably my favorite part of the entire thing. "Let me see your appearance. Let me hear your voice, for your voice is sweet, and your appearance is lovely." What is he communicating whenever he says those words to her?
Yeah. Well, he's assuring her that his impression of her is the way that he sees her isn't going to change by the words that follow him saying to look at him and for her to speak. That whatever the insecurity is, if she just speaks that to him, he's giving her the ability to just openly communicate with him without her having the fear that he's going to think of her differently or change his opinion about her or anything like that.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, if you go back earlier in the chapter, you remember whenever she talks about how he was like an apple tree and she loved to sit in his shade.
Mm-hmm.
She felt secure around this guy.
Mm-hmm.
It's stuff like this that made her feel that way,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because he asks her to open up and to help communicate what the issue is. And usually, whenever two people are growing closer together and there's some sort of conflict and one person won't look you in the eyes and won't talk, usually it's because they're afraid of how the other person will respond to them voicing that, right? Usually it's just it's just an insecurity that is giving rise to that. And so he immediately gets that out of the way and he says, hey, I've already made my decisions about you. I want to hear your voice. I want to see your face. But even before you say anything and even before you look me in the eyes, I want you to know that to me, your voice is sweet and your face is lovely, right? So no matter what you say, I'm not going to change my opinion about you. I'm simply trying to figure out what the issue is so that we can take these next steps because once again, spring is in bloom.
Yeah.
And so the guy, he just knows how to communicate very well. And this is something that you're probably going to hear every week of this study. Communication is key. Honesty and communication are probably the two most important things in any relationship. And we see that as especially true as this couple takes these next steps towards marriage. Because here this girl is withdrawing and he says, honey, I don't know what the issue is, but you can talk to me. And I don't care what it is. I don't care if this is a huge issue or a small issue. I want you to know that you have the freedom to express yourself and be honest about this because I'm not going anywhere. I've already come to my conclusions about you, right? You're not going to say anything that's going to get me to run off because I already know who you are. I've already done my analyzing and I wouldn't be proposing to you unless I'd already determined that you were somebody worth proposing to, right? And so he says, your voice is sweet. Your appearance is lovely. I already know what I believe about you. I simply want to hear you. And in many ways, there's a parallel between God and the church in that regard, right? Because God wants us to speak honestly to him. And the reason why we can boldly approach the throne of grace is because God's already come to his conclusion about us, right? Yes, we might be the worst possible people who have done the worst possible things, but we can boldly approach him and we can confidently speak to him because we know that he's already chosen to view us as righteous, even if we're not righteous in and of ourselves, right? And so this guy is loving her as Christ loved the church. He senses that distance and he is trying to mend that distance by simply telling her, hey, I love you and you don't have anything to fear, which is really cool. And then he says this, and different translations will debate on who's saying this. To me, it makes the most sense that the guy is the one speaking. He says, seize the foxes for us, the little foxes that are wreaking destruction on the vineyards while our vineyards are in blossom. So what does he say?
Yeah, so the imagery here is really cool. I love like the very like nature garden imagery. I think it's fun. But he's basically equating like the foxes to their issue that they're having at the moment. And he's saying, if there's an issue, let's bring it to the surface and catch the fox while it's young before it goes and it wrecks this garden that we have built over this time of us getting to know one another, so that it doesn't ruin our ability to like get married to one another. So he's basically saying like, let's figure out what the issue is now and let's solve it and let's move forward together. Yeah,
and so when it comes to principles that we're learning here, you're learning that you need to handle conflict as early as possible, right? A lot of the times what couples will do is they'll say, oh, well, this isn't a big issue. Let's just put it on the shelf and move on. And they'll allow it to build up until 10, 20 years down the road. All of a sudden, that small issue has snowballed into this huge thing. Or you know what? Maybe sometimes the issue will just go away. But the thing is, this guy is putting communication above everything, honesty and communication. And he says, go grab the foxes, right? The imagery is of a fox going through a vineyard, right? And foxes, if you don't know about it, they will destroy an entire vineyard. And even if it's a tiny little fox, it can cause a whole lot of destruction. And so you might think that this one little thing, this small little piece of conflict between you and this other person isn't a big deal, but it's really just better to get it out in the open and address it, right? Because you might not think it's a big deal, but little foxes can cause a lot of destruction. And so he says, hey, darling, let me see your face. Let me hear your voice. Seize the foxes for us, the little foxes that are wreaking destruction on the vineyards while our vineyards are in blossom. He says, this relationship we have, it's a beautiful thing. Don't let a little fox destroy it while it's blossoming, right? We've got an amazing thing right here. We are on the verge of committing ourselves to one another and we can have a great life together. I don't know what the issue is that's holding you back, but let's just handle it.
Mm.
And one thing that I tried to highlight with the group is that we're not supposed to look at this and view it like this was like some giant, huge conflict. It's not like that this girl outright rejected this guy. It could have been that, but we don't know. He describes it as a little fox, right? It seems like this was a small issue. And even whenever he showed up over the hills, it's not like she was like repulsed by him.
Right.
No, she was excited that he was there. There was just something in between them, and he knew her so well that he wanted to address this, right? Mm-hmm. If anything, people might think that this is being blown out of proportion. Yeah. But he values this relationship so much that he doesn't want anything to hinder them from being the best they can be. And so he says, hey, I don't know what the issue is. I don't know if it's my fault. I don't know if it's your fault, but let's talk about it. Let's seize that fox. Let's get it before it ruins this amazing thing we have. Let's just address it, get it out in the open, and let's fix it, because I want to be with you. That's what he's communicating, right? I want to be with you. I have determined I want to be with you. So just talk with me. Look me in the eyes. Speak to me. Let's get it out there. Let's seize the fox. Let's take care of it. And this is just, honestly, just a great dude. Everything he says, and I feel like I just highlight this every week. Yeah. He sets the standard, and he sets the bar really high for guys. And really, you have to realize this isn't just for guys. Guys and girls should be both living by these principles. Right. But he is just demonstrating how to communicate very, very well, and how to love really, really well. Because if you're the girl in the situation, he's saying the right words, right? Because he's giving her the freedom to express herself truly. And he's, through that, demonstrating that he cares so much about the relationship that he is willing to bear some of that burden, right? He's like, I don't want you to go through this alone. Let's seize the foxes. Let's get rid of them. Let's work through this together. You can just hole up and you can do that, but I don't want to be with a person who's not communicating. I want to be with somebody who will talk with me. So talk with me. Let's figure this out. Let's get it out in the open. Let's take care of it, because I see you. I love you. I want to be with you. And that leads us to the girl's response. I do see that I colored the number 17 wrong. That's my fault.
Oh. I didn't even notice that. Yeah.
Could you read how this girl responds?
Yeah. She says, my beloved is mine, and I am his. He who shepherds his flock among the lilies, until the day breeze and the shadows flee. Turn, my beloved, and be like a gazelle or a young stag on the mountains of Bether.
Yeah. And Bether there, or Bether, that just means clefts. And so some other translations will say the clefts of the mountains. That's probably a better translation, because we don't really know where Bether would be, if it's actually a place. But what does it seem? Let's talk about verse 16 first. Yeah. And we can really go through this part probably a little bit quickly, because this is just like the resolution here. Yeah. What is the effect of this man's words on this girl?
Well, it seems like his words to her are really just a soothing balm to whatever insecurity or kind of whatever was going on, to where her saying, my beloved is mine and I am his, she's kind of accepting the proposal, and the idea that she's like, yeah, I want to go ahead and go into marriage with you. And so his words were just the perfect thing to kind of ease her like insecurities or her whatever was causing her to retreat back. So
yeah, and we just kind of get to see that like what I love is that once again we don't see them wrestling through this issue,
the conflict,
right? We don't see the actual resolution there. We simply get to see that the way that he spoke to her and the way that he initiated this made her feel so comfortable that she was left with the desire to give herself to him, right? And she says, my beloved is mine and I am his. This is marriage imagery, right? They're not married yet. We're going to see that in the next chapter. But the imagery right here is of marriage, right? It is the idea of mutual ownership. Like whenever Paul talks about it in the New Testament, that like, a husband's body is not his own, it is his wife's, and a wife's body is not her own, it is her husband's. That is the imagery that she is conveying here. I belong to him, he belongs to me. And I don't think that's because they currently do, but it's because through his words, she has arrived at the place where she feels she can safely give herself to him. And so she is ready to take that next step into marriage. And you see that in the next phrase, he who shepherds his flocks among the lilies. Later on, this phrase is going to show up and there's going to be some heavy sexual connotations to it. Right here, I think that it's because she's wanting to take that next step. And we know that he is a shepherd and he has compared her to lilies. She has compared herself to lilies. He has compared her to lilies. And so you have this idea that he shepherds among the lilies. He is with her.
Yeah.
Right? And so now that door has been opened. That wall has been spread apart. The dove has come down from the clefts of the rocks. And she feels so secure in this guy's love for her and the way that he treats her and the way that he intentionally even maneuvers through these very vulnerable moments with her that she says, this is a guy I can give myself to. My beloved is mine and I am his. And later on, we're going to see I am my beloved's and my beloved is mine, right? That's the one that's more quoted more often. But right here it starts, we didn't even talk about this yesterday, but it starts with the phrase, my beloved is mine, because that is what he has communicated through his words, right? He started off by communicating that he is not going anywhere, right? He has seen all the crazy. He has seen all the stuff that she's going through. He has seen the insecurities. He has seen the issues. And he says, I'm not going anywhere. He has made it clear, I am yours. Right? That's why he's proposing. That's why he wants to go away with her. That's why he wants to do this. So he's communicated, I'm yours. And she says, my beloved is mine. And as a result, she can say, I am his. He shepherds his flock among the lilies. He goes to me and he spends time with me. And he makes his flocks lay down here at noon. Right? He has devoted his time to me. And therefore, she tells him, until the day breathes and the shadows flee, turn, my beloved, and be like a gazelle or a young stag on the mountains of Bether. What is she telling him to do?
Yeah. Well, for one thing, I don't think we talked about this yesterday, but I think it's cool how it goes back to the imagery of like the gazelle or a young stag. So the way he entered, and knowing that like in that situation when he entered, she was kind of like retreating back already. But then as he's exiting, she has a completely different emotion. Now she's like really excited and she knows that like they are about to start this life together, which is really cool. So I like how it's kind of like bookended there. But she's basically like saying like, go and make a house for us so that we can get married like as soon as possible. Like you're committed to me, I'm committed to you. Go quickly so that you can come back and get me, so that we can start our life together, which is so cute.
It's kind of funny though, because if you don't know the culture at that time period,
very different than
this,
now.
It sounds really weird because basically she was, he shows up and she's like kind of nervous, and then the whole section ends with her saying, "Get out of here."
Yeah.
It almost sounds bad.
Yeah.
But you have to realize that this is actually a good thing. Whenever she's telling him to leave, this is a positive thing because this is her accepting the marriage proposal.
Yeah.
Because in that culture, the man and the woman, they would meet together with their families and they would negotiate a bride price, and once they'd agreed to that, they would be betrothed.
Yes.
And then the man would go away to prepare a place for his bride. And then one day, and they didn't know when, he would come back, right? Only the father of the groom would typically know. Some people debate about that. But usually it's only the father of the groom who would know when the groom was coming back. And that was usually if he was building onto his father's house. And then the father would say, okay, go back. And this is the imagery that Jesus talks about a whole lot, right? Jesus talks about like, hey, if I'm leaving, I come to prepare a place for you, right? Because we are his bride. We are the church, right? And this is where Jesus shares the parable of the 10 virgins, right? Because they're awaiting the arrival of the bridegroom, but they don't know when he's going to show up, right? And so this is what would happen, right? You would get betrothed, and then they would go away for a while, and then whenever the groom came back, that was when the wedding ceremony would take place. That's what she is telling him to do right here. In these 3 lines, just going first, second, third line of verse 17, she is telling him to work with endurance, to work with haste, and to work with energy, right? Because she is saying, I cannot wait to marry you, right? So she says, just like you were eager to come to me and propose, I hope you show that same eagerness to go prepare a place for us. I don't care if you have to work all night until the day breathes and the shadows flee, right? I don't work all night, work till morning, work through until you get the house done. Turn, my beloved, be like a gazelle or a young stag on the mountains of Bether. I don't know where we're going to live, but go there, prepare the place, and don't you dare rest until that place is finished and you can come back and make me your bride. That's what she's communicating with this. And so that leads us into what we're going to talk about next week, which is betrothal and marriage. And we're going to see the difficulties of that waiting period. And the closest parallel nowadays would be engagement, right? And so we will talk about that next week. Do you have anything else you want to add into our discussion right now before we wrap this up?
I don't think so.
All right, cool. Well, thank you so much for joining me this week. It was sad not having you last time, but we're glad you're here again. Until next time, be sure to keep a smile on your face. Don't let anybody steal your joy. My name is David.
And I'm Brian.
And this is Now Let's Be Honest. We will see y'all later. God bless. You read a verse, you sing a hymn, the money's in the plate. Sundays you mark out for him, but even then you show up late. You bought the shirt, you wear the cross, but sin throughout the week. For 30 shekels and a noose, you kiss him on the cheek.